There's a specific moment in every war where the character of the fighting changes, not because the weapons got bigger, but because the reason for using them did. That moment happened this weekend. American forces struck the specific Iranian units responsible for killing 2 of our own troops, and the Pentagon said so explicitly, on the record, within about a day of the attack that killed them. I want to walk you through exactly what happened at that base in Jordan, what the American response actually looked like, and why the shift in how these strikes are now being justified matters as much as the strikes themselves. Every fact in this video comes from named sources, CENTCOM's own public statements, Pentagon officials speaking on the record, and cross-checked reporting from multiple outlets that have independently confirmed the core details. Where something is still developing or unconfirmed, I'll say so plainly. This is a story with real American service members who died, and it deserves careful, accurate treatment rather than pure spectacle, which means resisting the temptation to either inflate what happened for dramatic effect or to flatten a genuinely complicated set of facts into a simple good news update just because the headline promises a satisfying resolution. Here's what happened. On the night of July the 17th, Iranian ballistic missiles and drones struck Muwaffaq Salti Air Base in eastern Jordan. This isn't some minor outpost. It's the installation that houses the largest concentration of American tactical air power anywhere in the Middle East, home to U.S. fighter jets, remotely piloted aircraft, transport aircraft, and extensive supporting infrastructure. The base has actually been undergoing substantial upgrades, specifically meant to support a more permanent American presence in the region, which makes it a genuinely significant target, not a symbolic one. According to CENTCOM's own statement, posted on their official account, 2 U.S. service members were killed in action while defending against that attack, and a third was reported missing. 4 additional American troops were medically evacuated to Jordanian hospitals, though CENTCOM says they've since been discharged, and other personnel evaluated for minor injuries have already returned to duty. In the days since, unidentified remains were located near the attack site, and a 3rd American service member's death has now been confirmed, bringing the total from this specific incident to 3. It's worth understanding why Muwaffaq Salti specifically carries this much weight strategically, beyond just being the site of this particular tragedy. Jordan has spent years quietly deepening its military relationship with Washington, and this specific base has become one of the most important American footholds in the entire region precisely because of Jordan's geography, sitting close enough to Iraq, Syria, and the wider Levant to support operations across multiple theaters without the same political sensitivities that come with basing large numbers of American aircraft inside some of the Gulf states directly across from Iran. That's exactly why the base had been undergoing upgrades, intended to support a more permanent American footprint. Planners clearly saw long-term strategic value in it. An attack this direct and this deadly against a facility Washington had been actively investing in for exactly that reason is a real signal about how far Iran is willing to reach, and how few locations in the region it now appears to consider genuinely off-limits. I want to sit with that fact for a second before moving on, because these were the first American combat deaths from direct Iranian fire since March. That's a meaningful gap. Months where the war continued but didn't claim additional American lives in direct combat. According to Pentagon data, that brings the total U.S. military death toll in this conflict to 16 since it began back in February, with more than 400 wounded across the full length of the war, a running total that's easy to lose track of when coverage tends to focus on whichever single incident is dominating headlines that particular week, rather than the cumulative human cost building up underneath all of it. This attack didn't happen in isolation either. Open-source satellite data from NASA's fire monitoring system detected 2 separate heat sources at the base around 2 in the morning local time, in an area that appeared to correspond to where personnel living quarters were located, specifically what the military calls containerized housing units, essentially prefabricated modular housing structures used to billet troops at forward operating locations. A political commentator who's covered military deployments extensively made a point worth repeating here, that those housing units offer close to no real protection against a direct hit from a drone, let alone a ballistic missile, and that being killed inside one points to something beyond simple bad luck. And that's actually become its own significant thread in the aftermath of this attack, a real ongoing question about whether the base's warning systems worked at all. Reporting since the strike has focused heavily on whether troops received adequate advance notice before the missiles hit, and investigators are reportedly trying to determine whether this represents a complete failure of the detection and alert system, or a system that technically functioned, but simply couldn't outpace how fast a ballistic missile actually covers the distance from launch to impact. That's not a small distinction. A base that's supposed to be positioned deep enough behind the front lines to be considered secure, hosting America's largest concentration of air power in the entire region, having a warning system either fail outright or prove too slow to matter, raises a real structural question about force protection that goes well beyond this single incident. Think through the actual physics of what a warning system like this needs to accomplish, because it clarifies why this question matters so much. A ballistic missile launched from Iranian territory toward a base in eastern Jordan covers an enormous distance in a genuinely short amount of time, and the entire value of any warning system rests on detecting that launch, calculating the likely impact point, and getting personnel into hardened shelters before the missile actually arrives. If detection happens fast enough, but shelters aren't close enough or hardened enough, people still die despite the system technically working. If detection itself is delayed, whether by a sensor gap, a communications failure, or simply the geometry of where the launch originated relative to available radar coverage, then there's effectively no window at all, no matter how well drilled the personnel on the ground are at responding to alerts. Investigators are reportedly working to determine which of these failure modes actually occurred at Muwaffaq Salti, and the distinction matters enormously for what changes afterward. A sensor and detection failure points toward a technology and coverage problem that might be fixable relatively quickly, while a timing problem rooted in the base's basic geographic exposure points toward a much harder structural question about whether housing that many people and that much air power at this specific location was ever fully defensible against the kind of ballistic missile capability Iran has clearly retained even after months of American strikes aimed at degrading exactly that capability. This attack also wasn't isolated to Jordan. According to the IRGC's own statement, the barrage that night hit a much wider set of targets across the region simultaneously: Camp Arifjan and Ali al-Salem Air Base in Kuwait, an intelligence facility in Bahrain, and additional sites the IRGC claims to have struck in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Qatar. Iran's Revolutionary Guard put out a statement warning that any country hosting American forces used to conduct operations against Iran should expect what it called a corresponding response, essentially telling every regional host nation that hosting the U.S. military now carries a direct target on their own infrastructure. That warning, and the coordinated multi-country barrage that accompanied it, should be read as its own distinct signal separate from the Jordan attack specifically. Striking 6 different countries in a single coordinated wave, rather than concentrating solely on the base where American casualties actually occurred, tells you Iran's strategic messaging here wasn't only about Jordan. It was about demonstrating reach across the entire American basing network in the region simultaneously. That's a meaningfully different kind of statement than a narrowly targeted reprisal would have been. A narrow strike against just Muwaffaq Salti could plausibly be framed as retaliation specific to that base's role in prior American operations. A simultaneous multi-country barrage instead signals that no single American installation, and by extension no single host government, should consider itself insulated from this conflict, simply because the fighting has mostly concentrated around Iran's immediate coastline and the Strait of Hormuz up to this point. In Kuwait specifically, a missile struck a power and desalination plant, triggering a fire large enough to disrupt both electricity and water supply in the surrounding area, injuring emergency responders and oil sector workers in the process. In Bahrain, air raid sirens continued sounding as additional missiles and drones targeted the island. So this wasn't a single strike on a single American base. It was a coordinated, multi-country barrage, with the Jordan attack being the one that actually produced American combat deaths. Now let's get into the American response, because this is where the headline you clicked on actually comes from. CENTCOM confirmed that on the night of July the 18th, roughly a day after the Jordan attack, American forces conducted what was by that point the 8th consecutive night of strikes against Iran in this current cycle of the war. In its own public statement, CENTCOM said explicitly that these strikes hit Iranian military coastal surveillance and air defense facilities, maritime capabilities, and missile and drone storage sites, continuing what it described as ongoing degradation of Iranian military capability. But the statement went further than the previous 7 nights had, adding a specific line that American military assets also targeted Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces that launched attacks against U.S. service members in Jordan on July the 17th. That's the direct, on-the-record confirmation of exactly what the headline describes: a retaliatory strike specifically aimed at the units responsible for killing American troops, not just a continuation of the broader degradation campaign that had already been running for over a week. Footage released by the U.S. military showed strikes carried out by fighter jets and by Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from naval assets at sea, with at least one target site appearing to sit in a valley within mountainous terrain, which fits a pattern that's been documented throughout this war. Iran's Revolutionary Guard has a long track record of tucking missile batteries, launch sites, and other military equipment into mountain ranges specifically to make them harder to locate and strike from the air. That mountain basing strategy is worth understanding on its own terms, because it's actually a pretty rational response to exactly the kind of overwhelming American air power this war has repeatedly demonstrated. If you're a military planner in Tehran, watching precision-guided munitions and stealth bombers repeatedly find and destroy fixed targets across open terrain, dispersing your most valuable mobile assets, launchers, radar systems, command nodes, into mountainous terrain where natural rock formations, provides some cover from both visual and radar detection, is one of the few tools available to offset that kind of technological disadvantage. It doesn't make those assets invulnerable. American strikes have clearly continued finding and hitting targets in exactly this kind of terrain throughout the war, but it does slow down targeting and force American planners to rely more heavily on real-time intelligence rather than simply working through a pre-planned target list. That's part of why this specific retaliatory strike, coming together within roughly 24 hours of the Jordan attack, is operationally significant on its own. Finding and hitting a target hidden in exactly this kind of concealment-friendly terrain on that short a timeline requires either extremely current intelligence or a target list that had already been identified and was simply waiting for the order to strike. According to reporting on the broader trajectory of this specific escalation cycle, CENTCOM's statement described the operation as designed to swiftly punish the IRGC units behind the Jordan attack, language that's noticeably different from the more clinical degrading capabilities framing used throughout most of the earlier strikes in this war. President Trump addressed the deaths directly this weekend, telling News Nation that the troops died in service to their nation and calling it, in his words, a very sad thing. That's a fairly restrained public statement compared to some of his other rhetoric throughout this war. But according to separate reporting, he was also said to have given instructions behind the scenes to respond forcefully, described by sources as an order to rain hell in response to the attack. Whether that specific phrasing is verbatim or a paraphrase of the underlying instruction, the actual military action that followed, an explicit, publicly acknowledged strike against the specific unit responsible, matches that kind of direct retaliatory intent. I think this is actually the most important structural detail in this entire story. More important than the tactical specifics of any single strike. So I want to slow down and explain it clearly, because it's the kind of shift that's easy to miss entirely if you're only reading the top-line casualty numbers and the strike announcement without stepping back to compare how this war has been publicly justified from one week to the next. For most of this war, going back to February, American strikes were framed and justified primarily around degrading Iranian military capability broadly. Missile sites, drone facilities, naval assets, the kind of language aimed at reducing what Iran could still do to threaten shipping or American forces in the region generally. What changed with this eighth night of strikes is that, for the first time in this specific way, American action was explicitly and publicly tied to punishing a specific identified unit for a specific American loss of life. That's a different escalatory logic entirely. Once a military starts publicly committing to retaliate against the specific forces responsible for each American death, rather than simply continuing a broader degradation campaign, it creates what amounts to a standing, pre-committed response for every future casualty. A policy that essentially guarantees each additional American death triggers its own specific, named retaliatory strike. That's not necessarily wrong as a policy. Protecting deployed troops and responding to attacks against them is a legitimate and expected function of any military. But it does represent a formalization of the escalation cycle that makes de-escalation structurally harder, because backing away from that kind of explicit, publicly stated commitment to retaliate would itself become a story, a perceived sign of weakness, in a way that quietly winding down a broader degradation campaign never would be. There's a useful historical comparison worth bringing in here because the United States has actually faced this exact strategic dilemma before, in different wars with different adversaries. Anytime a military shifts from a broad campaign aimed at reducing an enemy's overall capability toward an explicit, publicly announced policy of retaliating against the specific parties responsible for each friendly casualty, it tends to lock political leadership into a much narrower set of options going forward. It becomes harder to negotiate, harder to pause, harder to quietly de-escalate, because any of those moves can now be framed by critics as abandoning a stated commitment to the families of the people who died. That's not a criticism of the policy itself. Protecting deployed troops and responding decisively when they're attacked is a legitimate and, frankly, expected function of military leadership. But it's worth naming clearly as a structural shift, because it changes the incentives shaping every decision from this point forward in a way that a purely capability-focused campaign never quite does. Let's talk honestly about what obliterated actually means in this specific case, because I want to be precise rather than just running with the headlines language. CENTCOM's own statement confirms that American forces targeted the IRGC units connected to the Jordan attack, and that's a real, on-the-record fact. What CENTCOM's statement does not include is detailed battle damage assessment, meaning independently verified confirmation of exactly how much of that specific unit's personnel or equipment was actually destroyed versus degraded versus missed entirely. That's not unusual. Militaries rarely release granular battle damage assessments within days of a strike, both for operational security reasons and because genuinely accurate assessments often take longer to compile than the news cycle allows for. So the honest, careful version of this story is that the United States did strike, explicitly and specifically, the forces responsible for the Jordan attack within about 24 hours of that attack happening, using a combination of fighter aircraft and ship-launched Tomahawk cruise missiles against targets including at least one site in mountainous terrain, consistent with how Iran typically hides this kind of military infrastructure. Whether that specific unit was fully obliterated, meaning destroyed as an effective fighting force, or simply hit hard enough to disrupt its immediate operations, is something that will likely take further reporting and independent analysis to actually confirm with confidence. It's worth pointing out why this kind of caution matters practically, not just as an abstract journalistic principle. Throughout this war, there have been repeated instances where an initial strike announcement, framed in maximally dramatic language by whichever side issued it, later turned out to be either an overstatement of the actual damage caused or, in some cases, an understatement of collateral effects that only became clear once independent satellite imagery, or on the ground, reporting caught up days or weeks later. Both governments involved in this conflict have clear incentives to frame their own actions in the most favorable light available to them at the moment of announcement. Washington wants to project strength and competence to both domestic and allied audiences, and Tehran wants to project resilience and defiance to its own population and regional partners. Neither of those incentives is unique to this war, but they're exactly why treating any single strike announcement as the final word on what actually happened, rather than as the opening claim in an ongoing process of verification, tends to serve you better as someone trying to actually understand this conflict rather than just react to its headlines. There's a broader strategic question sitting underneath all of this that I think deserves real attention rather than getting lost in the emotional pull of a retaliation story. This attack exposes what's genuinely a structural problem with how American forces are positioned across the region right now. Muwaffaq Salti was supposed to be positioned deep enough behind the front lines of this conflict to be considered relatively secure, hosting the largest concentration of American air power in the entire Middle East, specifically because it was judged to be a defensible, sustainable location for that kind of asset. Having it directly hit by ballistic missiles, with American service members killed inside supposedly protected housing, raises hard questions about whether that basic assumption about force posture in this region still holds after nearly 5 months of a war that keeps demonstrating Iran retains real reach against targets many analysts assumed were relatively insulated from direct fire. And the political pressure building around this cycle is genuinely bipartisan, worth noting clearly rather than filtering through any one side's framing. When 3 American troops were killed in a comparable strike back in March, President Trump said at the time that more casualties were likely and ordered expanded retaliatory strikes in response. That escalation cycle, more strikes leading to more Iranian retaliation, leading to more American casualties, leading to more strikes, has now run for months and 16 dead Americans. Later, there's a legitimate question being raised across the political spectrum about whether that specific cycle has actually produced any real deterrent effect, or whether it's simply been repeating itself without meaningfully changing Iran's calculus about whether to keep striking American positions across the region. It's worth adding some texture to that political dynamic rather than just naming it in the abstract. Congress has been engaged in its own separate ongoing fight over whether this entire war has been properly authorized under the War Powers Act, and with a resolution calling for withdrawal, absent explicit authorization, having actually passed the Senate last month, including support from several of the president's own party. Every additional American combat death adds direct pressure to that debate, because lawmakers on both sides now have to weigh continued funding and continued deployment against a rising casualty count that keeps climbing months after the war's original opening phase supposedly concluded. At the same time, there's an equally real political pressure running in the opposite direction. Any visible sign of pulling back or de-escalating immediately following American deaths risks being framed as failing to properly honor or avenge those losses. That's precisely the bind an explicit, publicly committed retaliation policy creates, and it's a bind that tends to get tighter, not looser, the longer a war like this one continues without a clear resolution in sight. I want to bring in the wider picture one more time before we wrap up, because a single night's retaliatory strike doesn't exist in isolation from everything else happening in this war right now. This 8th consecutive night of strikes wasn't just about the Jordan attack specifically. CENTCOM's own statement described it as continuing to degrade Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, which has been its own separate, ongoing crisis running in parallel this entire time. Iran's own IRGC has explicitly framed its retaliatory strikes across Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan as a direct response to what it calls American aggression, violating the ceasefire framework that had briefly held back in June. So what you're actually looking at isn't a single isolated tit-for-tat exchange. It's one specific deadly incident, embedded inside a much larger, sustained cycle of strikes and counterstrikes that's been running continuously for well over a week at this point, with this particular round distinguished mainly by the fact that it produced the first American combat deaths in months, and by the explicit, publicly stated retaliatory framing that followed. If you want to actually track where this specific thread goes next, here's what I'd watch closely. Watch whether CENTCOM releases any further battle damage assessment on the specific IRGC units targeted in this retaliatory strike, since that's what would actually confirm or complicate the obliterated framing beyond just the initial announcement that the strike happened. Watch the investigation into what actually failed, or didn't fail fast enough, in the warning systems at Muwaffaq Salti, because the answer to that question will shape decisions about troop housing and base defense across every other American installation in the region carrying similar risk. Watch whether Iran's IRGC follows through on its stated warning to regional host nations, because if attacks specifically targeting Saudi Arabia, Iraq, or Qatar materialize beyond what's already been claimed, that tells you this specific escalation cycle is continuing to widen rather than settling into the kind of retaliate and pause pattern that's characterized earlier phases of this war. And watch whether this new explicit swiftly punish framing becomes the standing policy for every future American casualty going forward. Because if it does, that's arguably a bigger structural story than any individual strike. A war that's shifted from broadly degrading an adversary's capability toward a running, publicly committed cycle of specific retaliation for specific losses. There's one more dimension worth adding to that watch list, and it connects everything in this video back to the broader question of how this entire war eventually ends. A war that increasingly organizes itself around retaliating for specific losses, rather than working toward defined strategic objectives, tends to become genuinely difficult to conclude through negotiation, because ending it requires both sides to accept that some prior losses simply won't be answered with further strikes. A political ask that gets harder to make of any government, American or Iranian, the longer the casualty count on both sides continues rising. Watch whether either side, in public statements or through back-channel diplomacy, reported by outlets with strong track records on this conflict, starts signaling any openness to a framework that doesn't require answering every single incident individually. That kind of signal, if it appears, would matter more for understanding where this war is actually headed than any single night of strikes, however significant that night's tactical details turn out to be. I know a story like this one, with real American lives lost and an equally real retaliatory strike within a day, is exactly the kind of thing that gets flattened into pure emotional spectacle by a lot of coverage. My goal here was to walk you through what's actually confirmed, what CENTCOM has and hasn't said on the record, and why the shift in how these strikes are being justified matters as much as the tactical details of the strike itself. If that kind of grounded, careful approach to a genuinely difficult story is useful to you, go ahead and subscribe. Because this war is not slowing down, and I plan on continuing to track it as carefully and honestly as I can. And leave a comment telling me what you want covered next, whether that's a deeper look at the warning system failure investigation at Muwaffaq Salti, the broader question of how American force posture across the Gulf and Jordan needs to change given what's happened, or a full breakdown of how this eighth night of strikes fits into the wider Strait of Hormuz standoff that's been running in parallel this entire time. I read every comment, and it genuinely shapes what gets covered here next. If this is your first video of mine on this war, there's a fuller back catalog covering how this conflict started, the fight over the Strait of Hormuz, and a separate, often underreported front involving Kurdish opposition groups along Iran's western border, and watching that broader arc will help this specific update make a lot more sense in context than taking it in as a standalone incident. Before I go, I want to say something plainly rather than rushing past it. 3 American service members lost their lives in this specific attack. And whatever you think about the broader strategic questions this raises, that's the fact that actually matters most here. I hope their families find some measure of peace, and I'll keep tracking the parts of this story that actually deserve careful attention rather than the parts built purely to generate outrage or spectacle. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.